Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel chilling stories and hidden secrets. Today, we dive into the tragic tale of a mother's deadly secret and the shocking twists that followed. Clara Matthews had always been the picture of suburban normalcy in Clearwater, Florida. A loving mother to her two children, Grace and Tyler, she kept a well-maintained house and spent her days balancing work, errands, and the responsibilities of raising her family. But beneath this outwardly perfect life, Clara carried a heavy secret, one that she had concealed for years. It was a secret that would eventually shatter her world and leave her family in ruins. The trouble began when Grace, a curious young woman in her 20s, took a DNA test. She had always been interested in her family's heritage and thought the test would offer insights into her ancestry. Grace wasn't prepared for the shock she was about to receive. When the results came back, they showed something unexpected, something that turned everything she thought she knew about her life upside down. The test revealed that her biological father wasn't her supposed father, David Matthews, but her Uncle Stephen. For years, Grace had believed that David was her father, but the DNA test proved otherwise. The man who had raised her, the man she'd called Dad, was not her biological parent. Her real father, the man who had fathered her, was none other than her mother's brother, Stephen Matthews. The revelation was staggering, and Grace could hardly wrap her mind around it. What she once considered a close-knit and loving family was now tainted by this unimaginable betrayal. Confused and desperate for answers, Grace confronted Clara, but Clara, as calm and composed as always, refused to explain. She stayed silent, offering no comfort or clarity, only a somber look of resignation. Grace pushed harder, demanding to know why her mother had kept this secret for so long. Clara simply avoided her gaze, her silence speaking volumes. Grace's mind raced as she tried to understand how this could happen. She was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, anger, disbelief, and above all, a deep sense of shame. She couldn't fathom why Clara had kept the truth hidden from her for her entire life. Why had she allowed her to grow up believing that David was her father, when the reality was far darker? As the days passed, the weight of the revelation only grew heavier. Grace, feeling lost and betrayed, turned to her closest friends and family for support. But no one had answers. People were as shocked as she was, and none could offer any explanations for Clara's actions. The more Grace thought about it, the more she realized that her mother had been keeping secrets for years. There had been whispers, rumors she had heard throughout her childhood, but nothing she had ever paid attention to. Now it all made sense. Clara's past, as it turned out, was full of hidden details and forgotten truths. Grace felt that everything she had ever known about her family was a lie, and the foundation of her world began to crumble beneath her. She couldn't understand why Clara hadn't come clean sooner, why she had chosen to protect her brother at the expense of her own daughter. The betrayal was unbearable. Determined to get to the bottom of it all, Grace delved into her family's history. She uncovered small fragments of information that hinted at a much darker side to Clara's relationship with Stephen. The more she discovered, the more disturbing it became. But the deeper Grace dug, the more dangerous the truth seemed to be. There was no going back. Her world had already been torn apart by one shocking revelation, and what lay ahead promised to be even more unsettling. The discovery of the truth about Grace's biological father sent shockwaves through the Matthews family, but it also caught the attention of the local authorities. Detective Rachel Stevens, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving complex cases, was assigned to look into the matter. At first, the case appeared to be a family dispute, something that could be resolved through private conversations and emotional reckoning. But as Rachel dug deeper into the circumstances, it became clear that there was something far more sinister at play. Grace, now desperate for answers, reached out to the police after discovering the shocking DNA results. She struggled with the betrayal she felt from her mother, who had remained tight-lipped about the whole situation. In her search for clarity, Grace believed the authorities might be able to offer some explanation for the horrific truth about her father. But as the police began their investigation, they found themselves entangled in a web of lies, manipulation, and hidden secrets that no one could have anticipated. Rachel began interviewing people close to the family. Neighbors, co-workers, and friends all seemed to have their own version of Clara's life, but the stories were inconsistent. Many described Clara as the perfect mother, always present for her children and dedicated to her home and community. But there were others who spoke in hushed tones about a darker side to Clara's life. Rumors swirled about her and Stephen's relationship, suggesting it had always been more than just familial. Some said Clara and Stephen had shared an unusual bond for as long as anyone could remember, though no one had dared to speak of it openly. Detective Stevens began to piece together a troubling picture. She learned that Clara had been fiercely protective of her brother, shielding him from any accusations or scrutiny. She discovered that Stephen had been living in close proximity to Clara for much of their adult lives, often visiting her home late at night and keeping a low profile in the community. There was no clear explanation for this unusual behavior, and it raised many questions. But the most disturbing discovery came when Rachel spoke with an old friend of Clara's. The woman had known Clara for years and recalled an incident that seemed to stand out in the haze of time. Several years earlier, a neighbor had reported seeing Stephen and Clara having a heated argument late one evening. The details were fuzzy, but the neighbor claimed to have overheard something that sounded like a confession from Clara, one that suggested the truth about Grace's parentage. When Rachel questioned Clara's friend about the incident, the woman became visibly uncomfortable, and her answers became evasive. It was clear she knew more than she was willing to admit. As the investigation progressed, Rachel focused her efforts on locating Clara, but she quickly realized that Clara had gone into hiding. Despite the police's best efforts, Clara seemed to have vanished without a trace. Her whereabouts were unknown, and there were no signs of her in the town or surrounding areas. It became evident that Clara had planned her disappearance long before Grace had made her shocking discovery. The question that lingered in Rachel's mind was why Clara had chosen to run rather than confront her past. Had she been trying to protect her family, or was there something even darker that she feared would come to light? The police intensified their search for Clara, but the more they learned about her, the more they realized that she was not the person they had assumed. Clara had been hiding far more than just a family secret, and as the investigation continued, it became clear that nothing about her past was what it seemed. As the investigation into Clara Matthews continued, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. Clara's sudden disappearance left many questions unanswered, but it also exposed a deeper layer of secrets that no one had anticipated. While the police worked tirelessly to locate her, Grace, unable to sit idly by, took matters into her own hands. She became consumed with finding out why her mother had kept such a life-altering secret for so long. The more she investigated, the more unsettling the truths became. Grace's search led her to a series of old family photographs, letters, and documents that had been carefully hidden away. She combed through the papers, each one revealing snippets of information that painted a chilling portrait of her mother's past. What she found was disturbing. Clara and Stephen's relationship had never been just that of brother and sister. Grace uncovered evidence of years of manipulation and control. Clara had gone to great lengths to protect Stephen, shielding him from the world while keeping his existence shrouded in secrecy. There were whispers of Clara's protective instincts going beyond what was normal between siblings. Neighbors recalled strange moments where Clara and Stephen would disappear for hours, always on the move, always hiding from prying eyes. The pattern of secrecy and avoidance was so deeply embedded that no one dared question them. But looking back, it all seemed too strange to ignore. It wasn't just the secrecy surrounding their relationship that unnerved Grace. There were hints of abuse as well. There were instances when neighbors claimed to have heard loud arguments between Clara and Stephen. Grace recalled faint memories of her mother's anxious expressions during her childhood when Stephen would come to visit. She remembered her mother's insistence that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, Grace had always felt something was off. Now, with everything she had uncovered, Grace realized that those feelings had not been unfounded. But the most unsettling discovery of all came when Grace learned that Clara had taken steps to sever ties with anyone who might have exposed the truth. She had moved her family multiple times over the years, erasing any trace of Stephen from their lives. Neighbors who had once been close to Clara spoke of her sudden departures and the odd way she would always make excuses for why Stephen was absent. Clara had become an expert at creating a facade, a perfect life that hid the turmoil within. As Grace sifted through the final pieces of the puzzle, she began to piece together a theory of what had happened all those years ago. It seemed clear that Clara and Stephen's relationship had crossed a line, one that was too difficult to confront. Grace couldn't fathom why her mother had chosen to keep this dark secret hidden, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Clara was trapped in a web of her own making. The shame and fear must have been overwhelming, leading Clara to conceal the truth for as long as she could. The search for Clara became more urgent as the days passed. Detectives were no closer to finding her, and Grace felt herself spiraling deeper into despair. She had learned things that no daughter should ever have to learn about her mother, and yet the answers she sought remained elusive. Was Clara protecting her brother from the law? Was she hiding to shield her family from the public's judgment? Or was there something even darker that she feared would come to light if she were ever caught? Grace's mind raced with questions, but one thing was certain: there was no going back from the truth. The life she had once known was gone, and the only thing that mattered now was uncovering the full story, no matter how painful it might be. Clara Matthews had been gone for weeks by the time the investigation reached a boiling point. The police had scoured every possible lead, interrogated family members, and pieced together all the information they could find. Yet Clara remained elusive, slipping through their grasp with every attempt to locate her. But just when it seemed like the case would go cold, something unexpected happened. Clara reached out. She contacted Detective Rachel Stevens directly, her voice cold and detached over the phone. Clara agreed to meet face-to-face, but she had one condition: the meeting would take place on her terms. She demanded a neutral location, far away from prying eyes. Clara insisted that she would only speak to Rachel in person, refusing to communicate through intermediaries or lawyers. The detective, intrigued but cautious, agreed to the meeting, though she knew this could be a dangerous game. The location Clara chose was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Clearwater, a place that seemed to be a strange choice for a conversation that could change everything. It was a desolate area, far from the main roads and covered in shadows, with only the sounds of the wind to break the silence. Detective Stevens arrived with her team, prepared for the worst. She knew that Clara had been hiding for so long, and the pressure to confront her had likely pushed her to the edge. They were ready for anything. When Clara arrived, she was alone, her expression unreadable. She wore an air of resignation, as though she had already made peace with whatever was about to happen. Clara's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension that filled the air. She knew the authorities were closing in on her, and now it was time to face the consequences. Rachel tried to keep the conversation professional, asking Clara to explain her actions and what had driven her to conceal the truth about Grace's parentage for so long. But Clara was evasive, giving only fragmented answers that revealed little. She spoke in circles, avoiding the core questions that haunted her daughter and the entire investigation. Clara offered no remorse, no explanation for why she had chosen to keep her brother's involvement in Grace's life a secret. Her coldness only added to the growing sense of unease. As the minutes stretched on, the atmosphere became more tense. Clara's calm facade slowly began to crack, revealing flashes of something darker beneath. She spoke briefly about the fear she had lived with for so many years, the fear of losing her family, the fear of facing the truth. But there was something in her eyes, something unsettling, as though she was hiding something far more dangerous than anyone had yet uncovered. Without warning, Clara bolted. She turned abruptly and sprinted toward the back of the warehouse, moving quickly through the shadows. Rachel's team, prepared for any eventuality, rushed forward, shouting for Clara to stop. But it was too late. Clara had already vanished into the dark recesses of the building. The police gave chase, but the layout of the warehouse was a maze of rooms and corridors. The sound of Clara's footsteps echoed in the distance, and the pursuit became frantic. As the officers closed in on her, Clara seemed to disappear completely. It was a race against time, but just as the officers thought they had her cornered, Clara made a final, desperate move. In her panic, she reached for something, a weapon, a tool, anything, and before anyone could react, shots rang out. The officers had no choice but to respond. Fearing for their lives, they opened fire. The sound of gunshots reverberated through the warehouse as Clara fell to the ground, her body lifeless. The meeting that was supposed to bring answers had ended in tragedy. As the police secured the area and examined the scene, the weight of what had just happened settled in. There were no more questions Clara could answer, no more revelations she could provide. Her death left a trail of confusion and sorrow in its wake, with more questions than ever about the family's dark past. Grace, still reeling from the truth of her parentage, now had to confront the reality of losing both her mother and the sense of security she had once known. In the aftermath of Clara Matthews' death, the Matthews family was left shattered, broken by the cascading series of revelations and the tragic end to a life that had been steeped in secrets. Grace, now forced to process the truth of her parentage and the shocking events that followed, found herself grappling with a sense of loss that was both deep and multifaceted. The truth had come at a heavy price, and with it Grace felt her world unraveling further. The police investigation into Clara's death was swift, but the circumstances surrounding it remained unclear. The warehouse where Clara had been found was combed for evidence, and although the authorities confirmed that the shooting had been a result of Clara's erratic behavior, there was no concrete explanation for why she had acted as she did. Clara's sudden flight from the officers, coupled with her refusal to answer any direct questions about her past, left the police with more questions than answers. Yet the case was ultimately ruled a tragic end to a woman who had lived in fear of her past catching up with her. As the media descended upon Clearwater, Grace found herself thrust into the public eye, her family's private agony exposed for all to see. The story of Clara's death quickly became sensationalized, with headlines focusing on the scandalous revelation of Stephen's involvement in Grace's life. The media's portrayal of the Matthews family painted a portrait of betrayal and dysfunction, but for Grace it was more than that. It was the loss of her mother, her protector, the woman who had raised her, albeit with a dark and painful truth. Grace spent the days after Clara's death in a haze of disbelief. She struggled to comprehend the enormity of what had happened, knowing that her mother's actions were irreparable. Yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, she began to understand something that had eluded her before. Clara, despite everything, had been a woman trapped by her own decisions, too afraid of the consequences to face the truth. In her desperate bid to protect Stephen, Clara had sacrificed her family, her peace of mind, and, ultimately, her life. As Grace tried to reconcile the love she had for her mother with the horrifying truths she had uncovered, she was left with a profound sense of emptiness. She realized that the family she had grown up with had never truly existed. The reality of her life had been built on lies and omissions, and now it seemed that there was nothing left but the wreckage. The question of why Clara had kept the secret of Stephen's involvement in her life, and by extension Grace's, would never be fully answered. In the days following Clara's death, Grace found herself withdrawing from the world. She distanced herself from her friends and family, retreating into a solitary existence. The once familiar streets of Clearwater, the places where she had walked as a child, now felt alien to her. She no longer knew who she was or where she belonged. The revelation of her true parentage, compounded by her mother's tragic end, left Grace adrift in a sea of confusion and grief. As time passed, Grace came to the painful realization that she would never be able to restore the fractured relationship she had once had with her mother. There would be no closure, no opportunity to confront Clara with the questions that had haunted her, and with Clara's death, the final chapter of the Matthews family's twisted saga had closed. Yet, for Grace, the story was far from over. The truth had come at an unbearable cost, but now she was left to rebuild her life in the wake of the destruction that had been wrought. The journey forward would be a long one, but Grace knew that it was the only path left to her.